TESOL Pop, Season 11, Episode 9. Can debating controversial topics help science students become better communicators? Welcome back to TESOL Pop, the mini podcast for busy teachers. I'm your host, Laura Wilkes, and in today's episode, we're diving into the unexpected ways academic debate can strengthen language skills, critical thinking, and teamwork, even in the most scientific of classrooms. My guest is Anila Ruth Scott-Monkhouse, a university lecturer who's bringing debate into English for academic purposes for PhD students in STEM. Her students, future chemists, engineers, physicists, and more, go head-to-head in structured team debates on real-world issues like the gender gap in science or the rise of AI. But here's the twist. They don't know which side they are arguing until just before the event. This episode explores how debate can build students' confidence beyond small talk, prepare them for conference Q&As, and equip them with language for spontaneous, persuasive discussions. So, without further delay, let's join the conversation where Anila describes what debate means to her.
I would call it a challenge between minds, and there is an element of competition. It involves preparation, research, analysis of data, public speaking, because we're talking about PhD students debating in, let's call it loosely, the British parliamentary style, with that kind of approach. We try to create a scientific look, let's say.
And so when your students are debating, is this, when you say parliamentary style, I'm thinking they're kind of working in teams, they're taking turns to kind of represent their argument for their team. Have I got that kind of idea right? Is that what it looks like?
Yes, exactly. They are divided in two teams, the opposition and the proposition, but they don't know what side they're on until I tell them, let's say. They are given the motion first and they have to do all the research without knowing what side they're on. And actually, they believe they will be on the side they actually feel they're on, but that isn't necessarily so.
That's good. I like that additional challenge that you give them. And the fact that it's a team debate also must bring a lot of camaraderie and energy into the space. When I compare this to kind of individual debates that I've participated and witnessed in the past, that can be quite... it is very much a solo adventure, isn't it? But the team energy is a whole different dynamic.
There's a lot of teamwork, and actually the fact that they have to do the research on both sides initially. So what evidence do they have for the proposition and what evidence do they have for the opposition? Make sure that they do research alone, and then they have to share what they've found. So you've got that element of mediation in the companion volume of the Common European Framework, the latest addition to the reading, listening, speaking, writing. Now there is mediation. So they have to mediate texts to each other. So yes, there's a lot. And of course, they have to contribute also using part of their experience. And because we're talking about PhD STEM students, I forgot to say that. So we're talking about science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. These students have different backgrounds. So you've got maybe a physicist working with an engineer, working with a chemist. But also this is a multinational group. So you might have a student from Brazil working with an Italian student and with a student from Iran. And so it's challenging. It definitely is. There's also an intercultural element.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of layers, and it's not just like one event. There's a lot of build-up, it sounds like, in preparing for this event. That's also part of the learning process, not just the actual debate itself.
Well, what happens is I usually give them a controversial topic that in some ways relevant to the field they're in. One example is gender gap in STEM. There are very few women working in STEM. So it's relevant to them anyway. The first thing we do is we do some background reading or watching a video, or I give them some information and some vocabulary. That would be more of a standard English lesson, if you want, lesson of English. Then I give them a motion. One example is I told them the International Day of Women in Science has no reason to exist and should be abolished. So that was one example. And I asked them to find evidence that is in favor of this motion and elements that is against. And then afterwards, I tell them what side they're on. But the fact that we're talking about something that is controversial, like, for example, the presence of women in science, first of all, is relevant to what they're doing. And in the second place, I've had students bring in examples of their own country. I remember a student from Ghana mentioning what happened with a lady engineer in his country who then went into politics, and she set an example for the girls in the country. So I learn a lot myself, to be honest.
This is brilliant to kind of get insight to your process. And I imagine listeners are probably thinking, oh, this is something I can use in my classroom. So you set a topic that's relevant to them. These are STEM students, but they're going to be researching and debating in English. But you set a really controversial angle on that topic. Second, you get them to research both sides. They have to then prep, and then you tell them what side they're going to represent. That is very smart of you, because I imagine that means they have to really build a good picture of both sides of the argument, which means their argument will be better anyway when they know both sides, so they can argue in an informed way, knowing that they've already done the research. I wonder, what inspired you to bring debates to this PhD STEM student program? Because I don't think I've actually encountered this before in sciences, particularly. And I imagine you'll have to tell me, but this doesn't seem very common practice within STEM programs for PhD students, particularly. Am I wrong in that?
Well, I don't think it is. It definitely isn't at Parma University where I work. So it was a novelty, and I was pretty nervous the first time I introduced it. I thought, is this going to work or not? I was curious about debates and had been... I went to workshops and read about them and just couldn't think of how to use them. And when I was preparing for the course I teach, which is, as I said, this course, we call it study skills, because what we do is we try to focus on the skills the students need in their future research as scientists, as young scientists. It has a general format, but each edition is actually tailored to the needs of that particular group. And the needs analysis is carried out as a motivational letter that they have to write, where they have to address certain questions I give them. And in recent years, what came out more and more was the fact that they feel pretty confident in using English as the lingua franca of science. They feel confident in that, but then they're frustrated at the fact that they feel that they're not able to deal with what we could call more conversational topics. So I didn't really want to do small talk with them. I thought, well, it's not very, I can't see how I can fit it in a course like study skills, which is more academic. And I could see something there that could help me. And then one evening I was out to dinner with a friend of mine who's a physicist, and her husband was talking about the fact that he's German and he spent some time in the US, and he said I was okay when I was talking about science, but then we were talking about something that was more like everyday, or maybe just a discussion. I couldn't contribute my thoughts. And so I thought, okay, here we are. This is what I need. And I started talking to this friend and her husband, and I thought, what do you think if I use the debate? And it was actually my friend who's been working on gender gap in STEM who first gave me the idea. And that's how I linked it. It was very, very much cross-curricular, if you want.
You mentioned this is a novelty for your context, and I imagine it would be quite a novelty for some of your students too. How did you go about setting up with your students what you wanted to do and conveying to them what the value is? Because often when we bring something in that's very, very unique or very new and unfamiliar for students, it can be a case of you need to create buy-in from them too. And I wonder if that was something that you also noticed with your students, that you needed to go through a process of getting them on board with these debates.
At first they were a little suspicious, I think. It was like, what is she trying to get us to do? Then they realized that at least the topic was interesting because it was relevant to them. Another topic we looked at was, for example, artificial intelligence. Just to give you an idea, we've had 3 editions of these debates. And so they could see that it was in some way connected to what they are doing, and it was mentally challenging. When they carried out the research, they really got into it because they were looking for data. They had a scientific approach, really reading, looking for data, creating slides. They really had a scientific approach to it. When I told them that the reason we were doing it was to get them to be more fluent in something which was not familiar to them but also to be able to think on the spot, listen carefully to what other people were saying. They could see that it could help them, for example, even in going to conferences and having to answer questions in the Q&A part of a presentation. They have to present at conferences. So they could in some way begin to see there was a bit of lateral thinking there. I think the moment when they were a bit more nervous was when I said, now I'm going to tell you what side you're on. And it was like, oops. They were not sure they liked that because they said, well, you made it easier for the other side. Of course, I was getting a lot of that. I was making it easier for the other side. And I was saying, well, not really. And what was strange was the side that you would probably think was going to lose was the one that won, because they really struggled. They really worked hard at it. So the idea of abolishing the International Day of Girls in Science actually won, surprisingly, because they were so good at arguing that. The other team felt so confident that it was an easy win that they didn't. And I also told them that they were going to have judges, which were not only myself as a teacher of English. I have to say I have the support of two friends who are, one is a professor of ICT and the other is my physicist friend who's a professor of biophysics. They're very proficient in English. I had to reassure them that they were not assessing the English but the reasoning. And so it made it even more challenging for the students, because they realized that they really were going to be assessed, judged, if you want, by someone who's not only looking at their English.
Looking at the quality of the argument and rationale,
Exactly.
like you say. Can I just clarify, like, how do you decide who wins? You mentioned there's judges on a panel. Did you say 3 judges? And then
Yes.
Tell me more about that. Like, how do you decide who wins? Do you have criteria? What's the process?
Okay, how much evidence they've brought in, how they were able to tackle with the objections made by the opposing team, because it works like this. They have the constructive stage where you have, key speakers, speaker 1, speaker 2, and so on, of speaking on both sides. Then they have a breakup session where they can prepare their rebuttal, but they can only address 2 points that were made by the opposing team. So the way they tackle with, the way they deal with what came out is also an element to this, to help us decide and how solid their reasoning in and how much evidence they've been able to bring in.
That's brilliant. That sounds like a really thorough criteria to assess a good argument. So that must be really interesting that students are being assessed on that and less so on their language. I imagine that's maybe a bit of a mindset change for them as well, if they're worried about their grammar or worried about their pronunciation, to be like, no, I need to focus on the rationale and the quality of my argument.
It's probably one of the very few times when the students are not desperately focusing on the language. They're focusing on what they have to say. They forget about the language, or at least they don't concentrate so much on the language. And because they're desperately trying to win, and there's this element of competition and to be smarter in a way, they're really working on that, on convincing the judges that their point of view is the one that needs to win. We make notes as the students are speaking. So we say, Alessandro said this, and Irina said that. So we're making notes and looking at, and we know what side they're on. It's a very student-driven activity, because they have their own timekeeper. They know that they have to fit into the time they have available, and the timekeeper makes a noise. It could be knocking on the desk or ringing a little bell. So they're in charge there.
Anila, it's been really inspiring talking to you today. I'm so glad that you agreed to be on this podcast to share the wonderful work you're doing. Before we close, where can listeners find out more and follow your work?
Well, I have written a few lesson plans for humanizing language teaching, which is online. It's free of charge, so they can access it. I've published several articles. You can find them if you just do a Google search. I'm on LinkedIn. My profile is there as well. I'm currently working on an article about debates. It's not out yet. So I hope that that will soon be out. I have presented the topic at several conferences. It seems to have raised quite a lot of interest, which makes me very proud.
As always, I'm going to include those links in the show notes, so listeners, you can find those easily. Finally, you can support the work we do here at TESOL Pop by sharing today's episode with your teaching community, by leaving a rating and review wherever you listen to the podcast, or by even buying us a coffee by going to ko-fi.com/TESOL Pop. We are done.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you.